That afternoon, John Wilkes Booth stopped by Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. Again, he's performing at the theater all the time. His mail is getting sent directly to the theater. And this is something that he did, often, right? So while chatting with the staff, he learned that Lincoln and Grant were expected that evening. Although at the time, he didn't know that Grant was backing out. So he met with his co-conspirators around 8:45 p.m. to finalize the plot. Booth would sneak in and assassinate Lincoln. Lewis Powell would attack Secretary of State William Seward, and then George Atzerodt would then kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at the Kirkwood Hotel. And David Harold was basically to guide Powell to the home of Seward, and then they would meet Booth at a point in Maryland, and then they would all escape. And the goal was ultimately to decapitate the Union government in one coordinated strike, every major power player gone. The Lincolns arrived at the theater a little bit late, but despite that, when they entered their presidential box, the entire audience, roughly 1,700 people, rise to their feet, and the orchestra starts playing Hail to the Chief as Lincoln sat in his famous rocking chair. He sits down, and again, the energy in the theater is just electric. Everyone's like, we did it, the Union won, the good guys triumphed, like equality in America is like finalized, like there's no more like this is great, everyone's feeling so good. Mary Lincoln held her husband's hand during the show, and it said that she asked him, "What will Miss Harris think of my hanging on to you so?" And Lincoln smiled and said, "She won't think anything about it." Those would be his last known words. Now, normally Lincoln had strong protection, but again, this was prior to Secret Service, but typically, large, prominent heads of state would have some type of security. But that night, his security was a disaster. His regular bodyguard, this guy Ward Hill Lamon, was away in Richmond, and William Crook had the day off. Again, everyone's like, dude, the war's over. The good guys won. Let's just move on. It's fine. The man in charge was Officer John Frederick Parker, but Parker had a reputation for being unreliable. He had a bunch of different disciplinary write-ups, even before ever being assigned to guard the president. And on this day, he arrived 3 hours late to his shift, and during intermission, he left the presidential box unguarded to go drink at the Star Saloon next door, which coincidentally is the same bar Booth was hanging out before the assassination. At around 10:10 p.m., Booth entered through the front door of the theater and made his way to the upper level and actually handed Lincoln's valet, this guy Charles Forbes, his calling card in order to access the box. And remember, he knew the layout of the theater perfectly. He had been there thousands of times. And another wild fun fact, earlier that day when he was getting his mail, John Wilkes Booth drilled a peephole into the door of the presidential box so that he could actually peep inside without actually going in, seeing if the president was really there. Booth then wedged a wooden stick behind the outer door to block access from anyone entering. And he waited for the loudest laugh in the play when actor Harry Hawk said, "Don't know the manners of a good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dozzling old man-trap." At that moment, the audience burst into laughter. Lincoln himself is said to have been laughing. And at that exact moment, 10:15 p.m., Booth stepped forward and fired his single shot off, a .41 caliber Derringer, into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. The bullet entered behind his left ear and lodged near the front of his skull. Lincoln then slumped forward, and Major Rathbone turned to see Booth and lunged at him, but Booth pulled out a knife and stabbed him in the arm before leaping 12 feet from the box to the stage. When Booth jumped, his spur actually caught the flag that was draped over the box, and then he landed and broke his leg. Despite this, he raised his knife and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," literally meaning, "thus always to tyrants," in Latin. Some witnesses claim they heard him add, "the South is avenged," at the end, but others swore that he only said "sic semper tyrannis" before running off stage. At first, the audience thought that this was like a part of the show. They thought maybe this was like a crazy character, like an American guy during this British, sort of comedy. They didn't understand what was happening until Mary Lincoln started to scream. As chaos erupted, an Army officer named Major Joseph Stewart was sitting in the front row and jumped on stage and actually chased Booth during the commotion. Booth also slashed the orchestra leader, William Withers Jr. Now, it's also worth noting that at this exact show, it was actually full of a lot of different military personnel. Again, this was a popular theater in D.C. The war was basically over, and a lot of people wanted to celebrate. So there's a ton of active military in the theater, all the high-ranking generals, etc. So eventually, Booth makes it outside, and he made his way to the stables to find the stable worker holding his horse. He pushes him out of the way, jumps on his horse, and rides away into the night, heading for Maryland. Once everyone realizes what had happened, Charles Leal, a young Union Army surgeon, made his way to the door of the presidential box, but he couldn't get it open until Rathbone noticed the wooden brace that Booth had actually used to jam the door shut. When inside, Leal and a bystander named William Kent cut away Lincoln's collar, unbuttoned his shirt, looking for what they thought was a stab wound. Once Leal located the gunshot wound behind his ear, he realized that the bullet was too deep to remove. Knowing Lincoln couldn't survive a bumpy carriage ride to the White House, Leal decided to move him to the nearest house on 10th Street. So 7 men carefully carried the president outside in the pouring rain. When they made it outside, a man pointed them to the home of a local tailor named William Peterson, just across the street. Inside, there was only a small first-floor bedroom, and Lincoln, being too tall for the bed, was actually laid diagonally across it. And once the whole room was cleared, even of Mrs. Lincoln, the doctors examined the president for other injuries, and they found none. They applied hot water bottles and cloths and blankets to warm up his body, but they all agreed that Lincoln would not survive. And the very next morning, April 15th, Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m.